the impact of President Biden's infrastructure and reconciliation plans have drawn comparison to FDR's New Deal.
How do you compare in that way, legislatively, what Joe Biden has done so far, what he hopes to do in the next few weeks compared to FDR?
Well, this is what they call a transforming president, meaning a president who's not just trying to fix problems he's dealing with, but also change the system so that those problems are less likely to happen again. And that's why we honor FDR.
Because of the New Deal, the government had assumed greater responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. Citizens are no longer on their own in times of crisis. The government is more active in creating jobs when firms simply can't. People can trust that the government can act when the economy fails.
FDR in 1932, promising a beleaguered country a New Deal.
With these lofty and expensive progressive plans, can Joe Biden really be the next FDR?
FDR would come back to Warm Springs often to think about how to heal the nation and the world. That's exactly what he did, lifting us out of a Great Depression, defeating tyranny, saving democracy.
Is it fair to compare Biden to FDR?
Senator Cory Booker called the Biden plan historic, comparing it to Eisenhower and FDR in its size and impact.
His recovery plans, the most ambitious seen since the New Deal of the 1930s, redefined the role of government in the United States.
It would make Biden the most progressive president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Joe Biden has issued more executive orders, more substantive proclamations than any president since FDR by a margin.
What would Franklin Roosevelt say?
FDR, brilliant line. He said, above all, try something. Try a method. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something.
It's big, yes. It's bold, yes. And we can get it done.
Biden's gonna be FDR, we promise.
Like a 21st century FDR.
Biden's New Deal.
The New Deal.
A New Deal?
A 21st century New Deal.
Joe Biden's being touted as the new Roosevelt.
FDR got this right, Biden can too.
I got a portrait of Roosevelt in my office, okay?
So we have a brilliant panel to discuss what is at stake today in 4 key areas. We're going to start with jobs. David Raymer, who's written a fantastic book about New Deal 3.0 called The Case for, Putting Government in Its Place, The Case for a New Deal 3.0. And he will talk about the resonance of today's infrastructure and jobs plans under Biden and in comparison to the New Deal. Mary Ellen Sprinkle is president and CEO of the CORE Network, a nationwide network of Job Corps organizations, and a Hill staffer for some 10 years, so she knows the sausage-making machine as well. Then Michael Waldman, my good friend from the Brennan Center, on whose board I am privileged to sit, who has written the book on the right to vote, which he calls The Fight to Vote, and numerous other books, such as about the Second Amendment, a biography. And finally, addressing the obstacle to anything and everything happening through anything other than reconciliation, we have America's leading expert on the filibuster, Adam Gentleson, who has written a fantastic book on what to do about it called Kill Switch. All these books, by the way, are available through the Hunter College bookstore called Shakespeare and Company. So let me start with David on jobs.
Thank you. Our topic is what are the great needs of the country at this time? And I want to launch into that by saying that in addition to, as Jonathan Alter mentioned, the need in 1933 was action and action now, with action being repeated. What also was repeated a lot in that inaugural address was the need for work. Roosevelt talked about a great army of citizens toiling, of unemployed citizens. He talked about toil. He talked about our single greatest challenge was to put people back to work. Work was mentioned a lot. Not a safety net, not welfare, not relief, but work. So I'm going to talk about work, make 3 points about where we are today in dealing with the need for work. The first point I want to make is that, and this may come as a surprise to some people, but during the Great Depression, it was clear that the U.S. had far more unemployed people looking for work than jobs available. What the surprise is if you look at the U.S. labor market today, over the last 2 decades of this century, for the most part, there are more people at any one time who want a job than there are jobs available, more unemployed people than job openings. Sometimes, as during the Great Recession, a couple of decade or so ago, as well as last year, the job shortage was enormous. And occasionally, there are times when it disappears or seems to disappear using a conservative definition of unemployment. But usually that's temporary. And I think what we're seeing now is a temporary equalization of the officially unemployed, at least, and the number of job openings. But when you look at the data for most of the years and most of the months, using all of the measures of unemployment that the BLS comes out with, there are many more people who want a job than there are jobs listed. Typically, it's 2 to 1, 2 unemployed people using the official conservative definition compared to jobs of any description. So we have a job shortage. It's the norm. Sometimes it shrinks and even vanishes, but by and large, it's there. Policy should be based on the fact that it's there most of the time, and I think we'll be resetting back to a job shortage within a few months. So it's commendable that the Biden administration and Congress have taken it upon themselves in the reconciliation bill to try to create more jobs. My estimate is that there's between $16 and $19 billion allocated in 3 different pots to create more jobs. One pot that we'll hear more about involves the Civilian Climate Corps. I add up about $8 billion split between the Department of Agriculture and Interior to create Civilian Climate Corps jobs to deal with climate change and its sort of associated efforts to preserve the environment. There's also about $4 billion split between AmeriCorps and the Department of Labor, and another $6 to $9 billion, depending on the formula, in other Labor Department programs. We don't know how much of this will survive. It looks like the Civilian Climate Corps will, hopefully with a very large amount of money. So we do have very worthy, very large subsidized jobs programs in the reconciliation bill, which we can all hope will become law. And they will shrink the job shortage, but we need to go a lot further. So there are a couple things that I think are needed in order to deal with the remaining large job shortage that will still be there even after these programs are put in place. The first thing that we need to do is to be sure that the reconciliation bill's subsidized jobs programs are well run, that they're coordinated. In the legislation, they're scattered among different agencies. It's hard to find them. But they need to be coordinated. They need to be obviously operated with integrity and efficiency, as were the New Deal jobs programs. And they need to hire as many people as possible. It's also important, and this goes back to what was said in the prior panel, they need to be visible. People need to see that unemployed people were put to work. They need to see the workers. They need to see the projects. They can't just happen but be unknown. But there's a larger point that I want to make. The missing piece in all this is that it's important to create a big, permanent program whose primary purpose is to create the jobs themselves. Jobs are sort of a byproduct of some of the other initiatives that I've talked about. They're important, but they're of secondary importance. The CWA and the WPA, however, made jobs the primary goal. And then what they did with that work was important, but in a sense secondary. So we need to have a program that's large, fluctuating, getting larger when things get bad and smaller when things get better. We need to be sure it's very visible. We need to be sure it doesn't end after a certain period of time, because the crisis of a lack of jobs isn't going to go away anytime soon. And we need to have a program whose primary focus is to make sure that anyone who needs 40 hours of paid work can easily get it. That, together with other things needed in the labor market, higher minimum wage, paid leave, a bigger earning supplement, child tax credit and so forth, stronger collective bargaining, all are part of what's needed to get back to what FDR said in March of 1933, tackling jobs as the most important thing the government needs to do.
Thank you, David.
I'm Mary Ellen Sprinkle. I'm the president and CEO of the Corps Network, which is the National Association of Service and Conservation Corps. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. As this group knows probably better than most, nearly a century ago, this country faced some significant challenges, including the Great Depression, widespread poverty and unemployment, and severe economic degradation caused by over-farming, over-logging, and that caused mass erosion, floods, and wildfires across the country. At that time, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt worked with some of your ancestors to put 3 million young men to work, planting trees, restoring habitat, fighting fires, building a state park system, and a national infrastructure that we still use today. It also laid the groundwork for a very well-trained workforce and for one of the most strongest periods of economic growth in the country. And now, 30 or 90 years later, we are somewhat in a similar situation. Exacerbated by the global pandemic, youth unemployment is extremely high, twice that the national average, with numbers even higher for young people of color. In addition, we face dire consequences of climate change caused by decades of industrialization, pollution, irresponsible use of our natural resources. Temperatures are rising, sea levels rising, ice caps are melting, and we are subject to an increasingly frequent and severe natural disasters and storms. And so what we had referred to, I think as 100 or 500-year storms, now happen every few years. Hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes regularly rip through the same communities. And the wildfire season is about pretty much year-long at this point. 9 of the 20 largest wildfires in Colorado history happened in the last 3 years, and 2020 was the worst single year for wildfire in California, burning over 4 million acres. These disasters and storms, they cost millions of dollars or billions of dollars and lives, and unless we do something to address the root causes of climate change and help communities become more resilient to storms and disasters, it's only going to get worse. So today, we once again have an opportunity to take a bold action that has the potential to slow the pace of climate change, make communities across the country more resilient to and prepared for extreme weather and natural disaster, to develop the next generation of workers for a clean and sustainable economy, and in such a way that is equitable and inclusive and specifically benefits those populations and communities that have been left behind. During his first week in office, President Biden issued an executive order calling for the establishment of a new CCC, a Civilian Climate Corps, to specifically mobilize the next generation of conservation and resilience workers and maximize the creation of accessible training opportunities and good jobs, to conserve and restore public lands and waters, bolster community resilience, increase reforestation, increase carbon sequestration, protect biodiversity, and improve access to recreation and address climate change. And over the last 9 months, there have been more than a dozen pieces of legislation introduced in Congress to fund and establish that, varying in size and scope. We have seen champions in Raul Grijalva from Arizona, Joe Neguse from Colorado, Chris Coons from Delaware, Ed Markey, Massachusetts, and Secretary Schumer Majority Leader Schumer has embraced the idea of a climate change or a climate conservation corps. So because of this widespread support, I'm pleased to say that as we sit here today, legislation and the budget reconciliation package in particular includes billions of dollars for a new CCC, and it moves closer to passage and to the president's desk, hopefully. The legislation, which we saw for the first time last night, includes significant investments in AmeriCorps and several Department of Labor programs, including Youth Build and Job Corps, to engage more than 300,000 civilian Climate Corps members over the next 10 years. It requires that Corps members be paid a livable wage and have the potential to earn scholarship funding for additional education and training. The legislation also includes significant funding for the Departments of Interior, Agriculture, and Commerce for CCC projects to meet the goals that I just described above. Unlike the CCC of the 1930s, we don't have to start from scratch. There, as many of you probably know, the idea of a Civilian Conservation Corps really never went away. The Student Conservation Association in the 1960s started recruiting young people to help with the capacity in the National Park Service. In the 1970s, Governor Jerry Brown started the California Conservation Corps. Those programs, and actually many, many others, are still operating in communities across the country today. The Corps Network, which is my organization, currently represents 140 programs across the country. Unlike the original CCC, which was entirely government-run and led, today's corps are primarily community-based, nonprofits. Some are housed in post-secondary institutions and entities of state and local government. They engage between 20 and 25,000 corps members a year. And also, unlike the CCC of the 1930s, they are very diverse and inclusive. About 45% of corps members identify as female, and nearly 50% identify as people of color. In addition, today's corps members span the socioeconomic and education level spectrum. So a corps member might be returning from the juvenile justice system, or he or she might be working on a master's or exploring a career in land management. So a very diverse group of young people. Likewise, the projects that corps engage are very diverse. The Montana Conservation Corps, which was in an article I think that was included in our material, they might be building trails and fighting wildfire, where Green City Forest here in Brooklyn is retrofitting and weatherizing low-income and public housing and community gardens. So diverse work as well. Last year alone, corps members planted over 1 million trees, cleared more than 32,000 acres of invasive species and hazardous fuel, restored over 1.7 million acres of habitat, and more than 7,300 miles of waterway, and improved the energy efficiency of over 7,000 homes. So corps are doing and have been doing great work for decades. What this new investment will enable more than 300,000 corps members to serve across the country, and some will have opportunities to go across the country like the original CCC. Others will have an opportunity to stay in their own communities. It will slow the pace of climate change, build a skilled and equitable workforce, and provide economic opportunity to all. And like the original CCC, it will provide young Americans with an opportunity to interact with people from different backgrounds and experiences, to bridge the divides that we heard about during our last panel, and to continue to contribute to something larger than themselves. And as FDR said in 1930s, more important than the material gains of the CCC will be the moral and spiritual value of the work. And it worked nearly a century ago, and we believe it can work again today.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. Good. It's very encouraging, and it's so great to see the original CCC as the inspiration of it. I'd also note today's New York Times reports that the new package, the reconciliation package, has a total of $560 billion for climate. So way beyond the CCC, we're going to have tax incentives for and charging 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations, jobs created because of that massive investment in climate, hopefully, out of the new reconciliation bill. Now let's turn to a problem that is not going to be solved anytime soon, the challenges to democracy. Michael.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for having me and for your work with the Brennan Center and the Wallace Global Fund and everything you do. I believe we are in a great struggle for the future of constitutional democracy in this country. The stakes are that great, it's nothing less. And in many ways, the issue and the challenges are different from those faced by or addressed by FDR in the New Deal. They go much more directly to the structures of our democratic system and go much more directly to many of the racial divisions that were elided as part of the New Deal during that period. Now, we all know that voting rights and some of those kinds of political reforms were not central to the New Deal. Were not central to the extraordinary administration of President Roosevelt. It is the case that he did take on the poll tax, that the attempted purge of conservative senators in 1938 revolved around that to a significant degree, unsuccessfully, that the first national voting rights legislation in well over half a century was passed as part of the Soldier Voting Act, which ended the poll tax for soldiers overseas of both races, with Eleanor Roosevelt's extraordinary leadership. And in an interesting way, he did oversee, and the political coalition led to a significant change in democratization in campaign finance during the New Deal period, with the rise of political action committees as the way for labor to get on an even playing field for a little while, at least, with wealthy people and big business. But and it is also true that to the extent the Great Society was the successor, and LBJ certainly saw it that way, and the Voting Rights Act was one of the crowning achievements of the Great Society, that too was a product of the forces set in motion by the New Deal. But as I said, today, for many different reasons, we face a crisis in American democracy. Some of it certainly has to do with the changes in the country. Massive demographic change, a backlash to that demographic change of a kind we've seen other times in American history, but increasingly hardening into a politics of white national identity and white resentment. A political system drenched in dark money, overwhelmed by big money, and in its, oh, thank you, sorry. Overwhelmed, but that's the way, that's a hint to stay within your time when the moderator hands you a watch. Drenched in dark money and big money, and we're all very familiar with these things. And so many of these things came to a point in 2020, which in my view will be looked at as a rather extraordinary year, going into 2020 for so many reasons, but including around the issue of democracy. For so many, we knew going into 2020 that there would be a huge turnout and that the system wasn't really ready for it. But then along came the pandemic in March of 2020, and it looked for a while like we might not have in our country free and fair elections, like the pandemic would simply make it impossible. And there was a mobilization. There was $400 million from Congress. States, state election officials, business, labor, voting rights groups mobilized to make it so that we could have a real election, and so that on election day, despite the pandemic, and despite the voter suppression, and despite the lies, it was the highest voter turnout since 1900. As the federal government said, it was the most secure election in history, something we ought to celebrate. Now, what happened? We all know what happened. Trump's big lie that the election was stolen, the insurrection driven by that big lie, and now, in 2021, state legislatures embracing that big lie, passing the most significant wave of new voting laws to restrict the vote or change the rules of who counts the votes since the Jim Crow era. It's in many ways the great political clash of this time. These states are rushing forward to do this. Congress has the power to stop it cold, legally, constitutionally. The only question is, does it have the political will to stop it? That's the question we're facing right now. There is no solution to this other than federal legislation. And here I'm maybe a little more Pollyanna-ish or a little more hopeful than you might think. The bill now known as the Freedom to Vote Act authored in significant measures by Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is different from the legislation that was originally introduced, but would be the most significant democracy reform legislation in over half a century by far. Its companion bill has passed the House of Representatives. A majority of the Senate now supports it. The only question Adam will tell us about this is whether we can get it through the Senate, but I have reason to think that momentum is strong. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act will be brought to a vote in coming days. That also has passed the House. That also would strengthen and renew the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Supreme Court. It also has the support of a majority of the Senate. These are really significant matters. It's a significant thing as well that the Democratic Party, for the first time, has focused on democracy reform as a central political goal for the party in a way it has not in a long, long, long time. Speaker Pelosi has been an extraordinary champion of this. Senator Schumer has been an extraordinary champion of this. I'll note, I went to see President Biden speak at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia a few months ago during the summer about this. And he said in his speech that he regarded this as the most severe threat to American democracy since the Civil War. Extraordinary words. The question is, will the action follow? And I was a little discomfited by the following thing that happened. Before Biden came out, the president came out to speak, they weren't playing Hail to the Chief, so it seemed a little slapped together at the last minute. They played a soundtrack of classic rock. And whoever did it thought that the song that should precede the president walking out was We Won't Get Fooled Again by The Who, which, as you know, is a song about dashed revolutionary expectations. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, and then Biden walked out to talk about H.R. 1. So I was a little worried about that, but we have reason to hope. And the one thing I would say as we look at the extraordinary inspiration of the New Deal and the inspiration of being with so many people who have it in their blood, we're always looking for usable history. I want to suggest that the usable history here comes from several eras of American history. Yes, it comes from the New Deal, from the ambition and the understanding of power in our society, the understanding, as Roosevelt said in 1936, when he drew the line at his convention speech between fighting against British monarchy, fighting against economic royalists, and fighting against fascists at that moment, and for democracy. We need that ambition. We also need the understanding from another era, the Reconstruction era, where the Republican Party took the lead, that our racial divisions and racism aimed especially at African Americans is not something we can ignore as we push for progress, but must be fully addressed as part of the solution. And we saw that in the second Reconstruction as well during the Great Society. And the final thing I would suggest, and I don't know if this is bad form, that we look to the era of another branch of the family, the progressive era of Theodore Roosevelt, where they had many of the same social issues, many of the same corruption issues in government and failures of the political system, and they understood then that democracy reform had to be at the center of politics for years to come to save the country. If we do that, I actually am optimistic.
Thank you, Michael. Teddy Roosevelt actually signed in 1906 the first law, the only law, totally banning corporate contributions to political campaigns. That's how far we've come. So now to move from the realm of the possible to the realm of the impossible. What do we do about all this?
Well, hopefully not impossible. I hope that's not the impression that I leave you with, but certainly very difficult, and I don't want to downplay the difficulties, but I want to say thank you, Scott, for having me and for hosting this great event. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I just want to quickly sort of frame this up by talking about, I think I'm here to talk about the how of how we pass things, and what about how we pass things is different now than it was during the New Deal era, and what is the same. And so I would sort of focus on one big thing that's different about how we pass laws in this country now, and one thing that is the same. neither of those things are good. So I'm just going to say that up front. The first thing is what's different, and what's different is the idea that you need more than a majority to pass bills in the Senate. And by dint of needing more than a majority to pass bills in the Senate, you need more than a majority to make a law at all. There are lots of arguments against the filibuster. There is a constitutional argument that it is unconstitutional because by evolving its rules in this way, the Senate has changed the nature of our entire system unilaterally, simply by changing its own rules from a system where we were majority rule all the way through to one where you have to have a supermajority to pass a bill. And I think that's a very good argument. It hasn't gotten far enough in the courts, but I think the substance is correct. And I just want to dwell on this for a second because I think it has become so commonplace for us to accept that it takes 60 votes to pass things in the Senate that it's hard to sort of process how different this is than from the way it used to be. So I'm going to zoom back to the founding era briefly, and then I will zoom forward back to the New Deal era to get at what's the same. You know, the framers were very, very clear that they did not want there to be a supermajority threshold anywhere in our system of government except for a few extraordinary circumstances that they identified and wrote into the Constitution. These were constitutional amendments, removal from office, and treaties were the main areas where you would need a supermajority threshold. This wasn't an issue that they sort of you know, did as a drive-by or in passing. They gave it extensive consideration. They were very attuned to the question of whether there should be a supermajority threshold in the legislature, because as we all know, the Constitution was version 2.0 of American government, and version 1.0 was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation did have a supermajority threshold in its legislature, and it was put there for all the reasons that you hear people defend the filibuster today, which is the idea that a supermajority threshold would promote consensus and compromise. But in practice, what the framers saw under the Articles was that it did the opposite. It created gridlock, and it allowed a minority to wield veto power over everything the majority wanted to do. So they were very tuned into this issue when they were writing the Constitution. They debated it extensively at the Constitutional Convention. They wrote about it extensively in the Federalist Papers. And they were extremely clear that while they wanted to build in lots of protections for minority factions into the Constitution and into the Senate itself, those protections for minority factions were designed to give the minority input, to give it a role in the legislative process, to make sure that it could have extensive debate in the Senate, but that at the end of the day, if those protections failed to give the minority the ability to persuade the other side to come around to their argument, at the end of the day, whatever the issue was should come up for a majority rule vote and pass or fail on that basis. And there's simply no ambiguity about this point. James Madison, who conservatives like to cite as the sort of chief advocate for minority protections in the Constitution, was extremely clear about this. He considered it a matter of principle. He called majority rule the Republican, small r Republican, principle in Federalist Number 10. So, you know, this was also backed up by more than a century of practice. This isn't just sort of theory that was then discarded quickly. The Senate all the way up into the 20th century was a majority rule institution. It just was. So, you know, think of any bill that passed the Senate from its founding up until about the 1960s, with the exception of civil rights bills, which I'll talk about in a second. It passed on a majority rule vote. That includes every piece of New Deal legislation. The filibuster simply was not used very often, and it wasn't used to impose a supermajority threshold. To the extent that it was used, it was the sort of Jimmy Stewart-style filibuster that we think of that Jonathan was talking about on the last panel of a senator, going to the floor and talking for a long time. That was useful to delay a bill, but it did not impose a supermajority threshold. The senator would eventually stop talking, and whatever bill was being delayed would come up for a vote at a majority threshold. You know, we think about the golden age of the Senate and, you know, great compromise. The Missouri Compromise passed by 2 votes. So if there had to be a supermajority threshold, it never would have passed. So that's what's different. What's different is this idea that we need a supermajority, that we need 60 votes to pass things in the Senate. That was not the case for the vast majority of the Senate's existence, including the New Deal era. What's the same is that civil rights bills need a supermajority to pass. During the entire Jim Crow era, which of course spans the New Deal era, the only bills that were consistently required to pass a supermajority threshold were civil rights bills. How did they do this? Well, a rule was introduced in 1917 for the first time, putting a rule on the books that could be manipulated into requiring a supermajority threshold. It was called Rule 22. It's the rule we're dealing with today in trying to reform the filibuster. It was a rule to impose what they call cloture or end debate. And that ending debate was a supermajority threshold vote. So even today, when we're talking about supermajority thresholds, it's that cloture vote. It's an intermediate vote. It's not the vote to pass or fail a bill. Under Senate rules today, the passage of a bill is still majority vote. It's that intermediate cloture vote that the bills can't clear to get to that final passage vote that imposes the supermajority requirement. So the only bills that were forced to clear that supermajority requirement from the end of Reconstruction through the 1960s were civil rights bills. When filibusters were applied to other bills, they were the Jimmy Stewart-style filibuster. People talked for a while, the issues were resolved, or the senators gave up, and those bills came up and passed or failed on a simple majority. Civil rights bills alone were required to clear a supermajority every single time, and that is why they mostly failed during this period. What we have now is a system where we've figured out a workaround around the filibuster that we call reconciliation, which allows many categories of legislation to come up and pass or fail on a simple majority vote. Reconciliation is a relatively new thing. It was created in the 1980s. It was never used to pass big legislation of the kind that we're talking about today, but people have gotten so fed up with the filibuster that they've started using it and expanded its scope through a series of procedural changes and precedents that have been set over the past few decades, so that now we can pass multi-trillion-dollar bills through reconciliation. But what we've basically done is created a majority rule pathway for many categories of legislation, arguably most categories of legislation. That pathway doesn't include civil rights. And so what you're seeing under the Biden administration is a similar dynamic to what we had under the New Deal era, where bills on the economy, on climate change, on many other topics are able to pass or fail on a majority vote. The only bills that don't have the privilege of a majority rule vote are civil rights bills. Not the only bills, but the biggest category of bills today that don't receive a majority rule vote are civil rights bills. And so what's unfortunate about this dynamic is a similar situation where we can do lots of things through reconciliation. We can do lots of things through majority rule votes. We can pass up to $5 trillion in government spending, as we've done this year between the things that are on the table now and the American Rescue Plan that passed back in March. But we can't pass civil rights bills, and we can't pass voting rights bills. And that dynamic, where there's essentially a two-tiered system where many things get to pass or fail on a majority rule vote, but civil rights are forced to live or die by the filibuster and by a supermajority threshold, is what's the same. So I started off by saying neither of these things are good. They are both unfortunate, but hopefully they can change. It only takes 50 senators plus the vice president to change the filibuster. Like Michael, I'm optimistic that we will get there. I'm sure this will come up in the Q&A, which I want to stop and move to, but it is possible to change this. We just need senators who have the political will to do it. So I'll end on that somewhat uplifting and optimistic note and turn it back over to you, Scott.
So there's a lot tossed out here, a lot of rich topics for discussion. Let's do a Q&A. Keep your questions as brief as possible, and the panelists will keep their responses as quick as possible to allow the most participation. So a question in the room? Sure, go ahead.
Just in regards to Mr. Waldman's plea for usable history, I have a question for David Reimer, do you see the 1945 full employment bill, not the version that was passed in 46, but the 45 version, in terms of instituting mechanisms to maintain full employment as a model for what you're talking about for an agency?
Well, I haven't read that legislation in a long time, so it's hard to directly respond to your question. But I think, to me, the model in some ways is where President Roosevelt and Secretary Perkins and Harry Hopkins and others, Henry Wallace was on the Committee of Economic Security. That is, I think, the starting point for answering your question. What came out of that, not all in one piece of legislation, But what came out of the logic of that was the WPA, a massive jobs program at its height, 3 to 4 million unemployed people put to work, with, again, the jobs themselves being the primary focus, but then a lot of useful projects, many involving conservation. Behind that was, I think, the belief of Hopkins and some others that there ought to be a right to a job if you can't find one. Connected to that was legislation that didn't pass until 38, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act. For workers, there should be a decent wage. Going back to the Social Security Act, for people who had worked enough to build up enough credit, there would be unemployment insurance. That was actually, we think of Social Security old age pensions as the jewel in the crown of the law, but what kicked in first was unemployment insurance, so a temporary income source while you're looking for work. Ideas like disability insurance were promoted, dropped, later put back in, I think in 1952, if I have the year right. Old age pensions, of course, for people who had already worked. The point of all this is that the logic of this was a comprehensive set of policies to help adult workers in all their relationships with the labor market. Unemployed, employed, retired, with a disability. The logic extends to paid leave. You know, you can't get paid leave unless you're leaving a job you have and are planning, presumably, to return to that job. So I think all of these elements were talked about back then, except possibly paid leave. Many of them were included in 1935 in the Social Security Act, or came pretty quickly. Collective bargaining was part of it, the Wagner Act later in 35. How much of that was in the 45 law, I can't answer that.
Another question in the room? Tomlin.
Hi, this question is for Adam. I think it's pretty clear that the Freedom to Vote Act would be vulnerable to the filibuster, but then if it is, or since it is, will you think a carve-out will be done to make that passage possible?
It's interesting. I think that I think, you know, I'm less optimistic than I was at the beginning of the year, but I'm still pretty optimistic. And I'm not actually sure that it will be a carve-out. I think it might be a return to the talking filibuster. And it's interesting how this plays, because I sort of started the year talking about the talking filibuster, and then people sort of went to the carve-out, and then I feel like we're circling back to talking filibuster now. And it's because the talking filibuster, you know, Joe Manchin needs to be the hero of his own narrative here, and he needs to be, you know, this can't be a radical shift. It has to be a restoration of some kind for reform to happen. And, you know, a carve-out, you know, nobody believes it's really a carve-out is the problem with it. Because once you make a carve-out, everybody knows, you know, your rationale is legitimate. It's that, you know, nothing is more essential than democracy or than, you know, voting rights and access to the ballot, which is a perfectly reasonable argument. But everybody knows that once you start making carve-outs, you're going to continue making carve-outs. I mean, look at what we're doing with reconciliation, where this was never supposed to be used this way, and now we're passing $5 trillion in spending through it. So you know, it feels more like cheating. Whereas restoring the talking filibuster sort of has the aura of a restoration, of going back to the Jimmy Stewart, of sort of getting back to what the founders did intend the Senate to do. They didn't intend, you know, the filibuster didn't exist until the 1850s or so, but you know, getting back to the idea of unlimited debate. There was supposed to be a role for the minority to stand on the floor, have a platform to articulate their ideas, and the Senate was supposed to provide that in a way the House was not. And restoring the talking filibuster would sort of, you could argue, you know, restores that aspect of Senate tradition. So I'm optimistic that there's going to be a reform. I think we're probably headed for a showdown over that after Build Back Better and BIF, the reconciliation bill, pass, which hopefully they will in the next few weeks. So I think that's when we'll know. But I think that if there is reform during that period at the end of the year, maybe we have, you know, it's called the nuclear option when you do the reform. So maybe we'll have a nuclear winter here. You know, but I think the more likely reform is probably a return to the talking filibuster, which is good because it will allow the Freedom to Vote Act to pass, but also open the door for other things like DC statehood or other reforms that are essential to restoring our democratic system.
This is huge. So let me, Michael has a question for Adam, and then we'll go to a Zoom question.
Well, it relates to the talking filibuster because looking at it instrumentally, they could talk and need 41 votes, but with enough willpower, a minority can still stop the majority. So I want to ask your view of a version of the talking filibuster, which used to be proposed by Senator Harkin and Senator Joe Lieberman, which was, in effect, the first cloture vote, you need 60 votes. The second one, you need 57 votes. The third one, you need 53. But eventually, after many weeks, maybe, of debate, a majority can prevail.
Yeah, the ratcheting down. Yeah, that's something that is being discussed. Senator Merkley basically has an idea that's similar to that. It's a version of the Harkin proposal. And what Michael's talking about is, we all are we have the Jimmy Stewart example. We're familiar with these sort of dramatic examples of a single senator, Strom Thurmond in the 1957 Voting Rights Act, holding the floor for a long time. But those actually weren't that effective because one senator can only talk for so long, and you basically just wait them out and then pass the bill like later that day or the next day. What were really effective and the type of filibusters that did derail civil rights bills were when you coordinated with multiple people, and so you had, people passing the baton back and forth, and you could basically keep it going indefinitely. And so obviously there are 50 Republicans in the Senate. They could coordinate amongst themselves and keep a talking filibuster against a voting rights bill going indefinitely. So you need a enforcement mechanism to cut off that debate at a certain point. And this gets back to the framers' intent, which was the Senate originally had a bunch of different enforcement mechanisms. There was supposed to be extensive debate in the Senate, but when that debate veered from an attempt at persuasion into an attempt at obstruction, there were supposed to be ways for senators to cut it off. There were a bunch of different rules. One of them they accidentally got rid of in 1806 because nobody used it because it was sort of accepted that senators would wrap it up in a reasonable amount of time. So what Michael's describing is, you start at the 60 vote cloture threshold, then after a period of time, on the principle that the minority should have time to debate, you ratchet it down to 55, and then after another period of time, say a week, you ratchet it down to 50, so that eventually you have an enforcement mechanism where you have a talking filibuster, but you have a method by which a majority can eventually cut it off after the minority is given their time to speak. So I think that is under discussion. The thing about Senate rules is it's basically Calvin ball. You can write them however you want if you have a majority behind to establish them. So, they could start it without that enforcement mechanism. They could add it later. We'll see where it goes. But I think realistically, on the big ticket items, you are going to need some kind of enforcement mechanism behind a talking filibuster to actually get things like the voting rights bill passed.
Mac, we'll wrap up with a Zoom question. Or some.
Michael Warburton, who is one of the 170 people joining us on Zoom at the moment, among others, is wondering a question that pertains to two of these topics. Will climate change and the effort to counter it, with climate change and the effort to counter it, isn't there more than enough work for everyone who wants it?
I agree, absolutely is the answer. The challenge is to set up the systems, the structures, appropriate the funds, figure out exactly which people are paid which dollar amount, with which equipment, with material, special clothing in some cases, under which supervision, make sure the money is properly spent. It's an organizational matter. We've talked a lot here about policy, as we should, but it's also important to remember that part of the success of the New Deal, a part of the brilliance of Franklin Roosevelt as president, was his choice of extraordinarily competent administrators. Frances Perkins, yes, was the first woman to hold a cabinet position. She was also an amazing, brilliant administrator, as well as political figure in her own way. Ditto Henry Wallace, ditto Harry Hopkins. Harold Ickes was often criticized for being too good an administrator, taking too much time, making sure every T was crossed. So I think when it comes to climate change and other conservation of resources challenges, the problem is not a shortage of tasks to be done or people to perform those tasks. The challenge is the money and the organizational structure.
So the big follow-up question to that, David, is if they get $550 billion for climate. Does the president have executive authority to assign these jobs to fix climate change, or is he going to need legislation that is subject to a filibuster?
Well, I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I read it, certainly the money for the Civilian Climate Corps is appropriated to specific departments of the federal government for specific purposes. I won't go into the details. We could if you had more time, but I don't think the president has to do anything more other than say, I appointed you Secretary of Agriculture, Labor, Commerce. Here's the money. It's legally yours. Spend it. There are probably, however, other things that would require executive action, such as creating a coordinating council. That isn't in the law, I don't believe. But they can do it without the law. That's where executive authority would come in, as it did, I believe, for President Roosevelt, who created any number of coordinating bodies. So yes, we will need some executive action to be sure it's not a hot mess administratively, but once the money is appropriated to named agencies, that's the heaviest lift.
Thank you all very much. We will take a 3-minute break and come back with another fascinating video and our final panel. Thank you all.